Welcome back to Jeff Reads. I'm just basically reintroducing my Lord of the Rings trilogy review. This is part two of what was an extended review. I thought I'd cut it up into two pieces, so hope you enjoy the second piece. Okay, so now I want to talk about the sort of the ethical nature of this book, and meaning the good versus evil. I mean, this is a good versus evil story. One thing that I really continually find fascinating, and I continue to come back to, is the moral world that Tolkien lays out. So first thing I want to talk a little bit about is Sauron and the nature of evil in Middle-earth. And then about the ring and the specific nature of the ring. So I feel like there's two types of evil in this world. And I feel like most fantasy novels that have come from the Tolkien mold only do one, they don't do both. So the first kind is the physical manifestation of evil, right? An evil dark lord or a force. This manifests physically. They create horrible creatures that fight for them. They take over the world. They kill, they maim. They do terrible things to the landscape, right? It's all like a physicalized evil. And that's really what Tolkien's followers have really capitalized on. It's more physicalized evil. It's bad guys doing bad things in the world and overwhelming odds and horrible creatures. But in Lord of the Rings, there's another kind of evil that exists. So this is the spiritual evil. And this is very much comes through the ring, but it also exists. Sauron also is powerful enough where it exists out in the world. The ring it's like the ring is kind of a locus of a very powerful part of it, but it also exists in the world as well. So part of this evil is the divisions within the ranks of the good guys in this book, right? So part of the evil of Sauron affects the Fellowship. And early on, Boromir is one of the first ones affected by it. Like, in a sense, this version of Sauron's evil works in Boromir, and it starts getting into his ego and his fear, and it works on him. And so it divides from within. Saruman is ostensibly part of the good guys when this book starts, right? But also Sauron's evil and preys upon his fears. It's this sundering of forces within the good guys. Now, the interesting thing about this is it also affects Sauron's forces as well. Sam's able to rescue Frodo from the Tower of Shir-Thungol because within Sauron's forces too, the evil plays in. It also divides his people and his creatures in a lot of ways. Now, he's able to exert his will to a certain degree to keep them in line. But if he's not continuously, exerting his power, the evil that he manifests, and that is manifests in all of his allies and his creatures, they all begin to turn on each other. So that's like another level of evil. It's kind of a spiritual evil that exists in the book, which I think is very unique. Part of the nature of this evil too is sort of good and evil. Like, the good in this book is always willing to allow sort of the evil to repent. So in a sense, Frodo continuously decides to allow Gollum to give him a chance to kind of come back from where he is. And his pity, Bilbo's pity, and then Frodo's pity, the good force in this book is about pity and humility. And Frodo's kind of allowing Gandalf as much time as he possibly needs to kind of maybe come back around, right? They do the same thing to Saruman. When Saruman is done, when he's beaten and he's in Orthanc, Gandalf elicits him and says, hey, we could use your help if you're willing to kind of humble yourself to this fight. And the evil that's in Saruman, he refuses. And in a sense, being on the side of good in this world, one has to humble oneself. And these bad characters on the other side who are not willing to do so kind of come to bad ends. Obviously, Gollum dies in Mount Doom. Saruman is killed by Wormtongue. Wormtongue also is a character who is given a chance to leave Saruman, but can't bring himself to do it for reasons we don't really understand. But again, the good forces in this world are not just we're good guys and strong and we're going to fight the bad guys. They also exemplify humility and pity, which is, in one sense, a very subtle force that doesn't necessarily manifest itself in any kind of puissant way. But like the theme of a lot of our heroes not being incredibly powerful, the force of good in the world too, this good power, this ethical good in this world, is really more about humility and pity, not necessarily anything willfully good or willfully strong. Okay, so let's talk about the nature of the ring. So the ring is, it's in the title, Lord of the Rings, right? It's a fascinating thing. So first of all, it makes the wearer disappear in the real world, right? And so to me, that's a metaphor for kind of a moral disappearance. I always found that some part of H.G. Wells' The Invisible Man was kind of like that, where it's like when you can no longer see yourself in the mirror, you're free to kind of be amoral, because there's no more reckoning, there's no more consciousness of what you do. And I feel like the ring is kind of a little version of this, where you disappear, and so you can do great harm and great horribleness. And the more you wear the ring, the more you disappear, you kind of disappear to yourself, and you become an amoral, evil creature. So I think it's kind of my take on the nature of the ring in one very specific sense. But so what it does is this evil, the spiritual evil in the book, through the ring, it goes to work on anyone who wears it. It goes to work on their ego, and what it does is it seeks to have the ego of the wearer expand and enlarge, and will to power, right? It's sort of like this thing where it's convincing you that you can be powerful, you can have your way, you can, even as Gandalf said, the ring would have a power over me, over the desire to do good. That's how it would start. It's a wonderful, subtle thing. And it's not out of cowardice that a lot of people turn down the ring. It's out of a very, very subtle understanding that once one's ego becomes inflamed past a certain breaking point, there is no good. Right? It's only going to be evil. And you're deluded by acquiring power in any kind of way, that you're going to ultimately do good. Like it's, with that classic line, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think that's the nature of the ring as well. All right, so I want to talk about the ring and who was affected by it, and what that kind of how it'll explain the nature a little bit of what this is about. So obviously Boromir was the first one we saw that was affected by it. He was deathly afraid of Gondor failing and falling. His father was the ruler. He loved his nation. So the ring, in one sense, is playing upon his fear of that, and then on the other hand, it's preying upon his desire, like, if I could take this thing, I can ameliorate my fear. Like, if I take the ring and bring it to Gondor, whether I'll use it or my father will use it, I won't be so afraid. I'll acquire power enough perhaps to fend off the power of Mordor. And so rather than, Boromir's not the deepest guy in the world, so he's not thinking in terms of morality and ethics. He's just thinking he's a very practical person. He's a good man. But because he's practical and he's not very ethically deep, the ring's able to prey upon his goodness by saying, no, this is to defeat Sauron. Like, I want to take this back to Gondor. And his fear of, like, I don't want Gondor to fall. It's a great nation and the West may fall afterwards. So, and the ring wins. It corrupts him. And eventually he tries to take it from Frodo and he pays the ultimate price. So then you have beings who are offered the ring and who were ethically sophisticated enough to recognize that it was a test of evil. So Gandalf at first is offered the ring by Frodo, and he tells Frodo, like, I would first seek to use the ring over a power to do good, but through me, the ring would then have a power that would be horrible. And as a member of the Istari, he might actually be able to kill and defeat Sauron and keep the ring for himself. But so even someone like Gandalf, who's a very powerful being, recognizes the lie of absolute power and of what the ring would do to him, and puts it by. So he passes the ethical test. The second person to do it is Galadriel. She also has a similar thing. Instead of a Dark Lord, you would have a queen, terrible and beautiful as the sun, all who would love me in despair. Right? Great lines. And it lets her, she's inflamed by it briefly, and then it passes over, and she's like, and for her, the choice is, she takes the ring, the three rings of the elves, and the elves could possibly remain in Middle-earth and grow in power. But she recognizes that it would just, with that, it would corrupt and destroy the elves ultimately. So her kind of choice is a little harder than Gandalf's, because the three rings are going to diminish in power when the one is destroyed. And so the elves are going to continue to diminish in Middle-earth and go into the west. So it's kind of like the ending of their time, and they're all going back to, I don't know if it's Valinor or the Blessed Realm. I'm not exactly sure where they go, but she kind of turns it away for her, but for her race. That's like, but she's wise to the nature of power, so she does. Then I feel like Aragorn is another person who could have taken it in Bree. Aragorn, also had a very deep desire to, he's going to be king, and he's going to be the one, supposedly, in that part of the novel where they're like, well, he's going to be the one to lead the forces against Mordor. So he, if he took this thing, it would greatly aid him if he had the ring and the sword of Elendil. But he passes the test as well, because Frodo's totally in his power in Bree, and he doesn't blink. So Aragorn also passes. And last but not least, Faramir passes the test. Now, Faramir also is struggling with, the ring could inflame him. If I brought the ring to my dad, because, there is this rivalry where Denethor really is like, I wish you would have gone in his stead. He's actually telling Faramir, I wish you were dead instead of my son Boromir. So Faramir comes to this point where it's like, I could bring this ring back, and, the love of my father, right? What a powerful thing between fathers and sons. And, it's right there. It's just Sam and Frodo and in his power, and he can take it. And he recognizes the truth of it ethically and passes, right? So these are 4 characters who were able to walk away, and they're true heroes. To me, in a way, these are the ethical heroes of the book, because they were like, their lives were beset, and they were faced with likelihood of certain doom by the victory of Sauron, which didn't look like it could be fought. But even in that place, decided to say no. That they would rather be, and this is to me a very core thing of this book, they would rather die or be or diminish or lose than use the means of the enemy to defeat the enemy. And I think this is a big deal in Tolkien's spiritual work. Okay, so now you have the ring bearers, right? So you have obviously Gollum, the first ring bearer after, Isildur was really the first one after Sauron. Didn't last very long. It betrayed him quickly. He was killed. Then Gollum had it, and Gollum had it for a long time. And again, I said this elsewhere here when I talked about Gollum. Gollum has very little will to power, very small power in the world. So the ring, it completely took him over and enveloped him, but there wasn't much there to begin with. So, and he wound up taking himself like under the mountains of Mirkwood, the Misty Mountains, I think it was. So there, the ring is stuck under the mountain with this kind of wrung-out creature. It had kind of nowhere to go, and so Gollum completely fell prey to the ring, but he had no personal power of his own. So it didn't really have anywhere to go, and no real malice came in the wider world, that was of a larger sense. Now Bilbo, the next ring bearer, Bilbo gets it, and there's not much of an ethical issue with the ring in The Hobbit. The ring in The Hobbit is just kind of this magical thing where he gets to disappear. He has his test where he has the ring for a long time in the Shire, and obviously, there's this moment when he's about to leave to go to Rivendell, and he struggles with Gandalf. Gandalf keeps saying, it's still in your pocket, you didn't leave it, it's not here, it's not here. And there's a moment where Gandalf kind of has to, threaten him a little bit and kind of step in to shock him. And Bilbo, in a way, he's probably the strongest moral character. And I think, again, this is Tolkien saying that the beauty and the deep truth of, everyday, possibly provincial living, just the average human being that's not concerned with greatness and aggrandizing themselves, and who's just kind of small-minded and lives simple life wherever they are. I think in Tolkien's view, the moral fiber of these people is superior to pretty much everyone else. Maybe not in some ways expressible, but it's kind of in there deeply anyway. I don't know if I'm getting that kind of across, but to me, Bilbo doesn't. He doesn't think much of himself, and I think the ring has a tough time manipulating people who are deeply humble. And Bilbo is one of those people. He doesn't think he's anything. He's just like, I'm a guy. I'm just a hobbit. I did this thing. he doesn't think much of himself. So the ring doesn't have a lot of places to grab on with him. So when it comes time to let it go, he's actually able to let it go because there was never a place in his mind where it really, really got him, or like, I'm going to be Bilbo the Great, or like, it never was able to kind of quicken his ego to a certain point where he was now never going to let it go. So he's kind of the most profound moral hero in the books because of how little hold the ring had on him, for how long he had it. And the fact that he was the only person who had the ring. I mean, these other folks who turned it down never really had it. The only person who bore the ring for a long period of time who was able to walk away from it. And to me, that's profound. And possibly Bilbo was able to do this because he began the ownership of the ring with pity. There's this great line when Frodo says, pity Bilbo didn't stab the vile creature. And Gandalf says, what a pity, it was pity that stayed his hand. Pity and mercy, not to strike without need. And he has been well rewarded, Frodo. Be sure that he took so little hurt from the evil and escaped in the end because he began his ownership of the ring so, with pity. Right? He could have killed Gollum back onto the mountain and he didn't. So again, this is a huge undercurrent of why, of Bilbo's moral nature and why he was able to walk away. So Frodo, not as strong as Bilbo, had it for maybe didn't have it for the longest time, but probably took the most pounding from it because he had it at a time when Sauron was really looking for it. And he had it much closer to its point of origin. So the ring was so much more powerful when he was closer to Mount Doom, and he took the most from it for sure. And so the thing is, Frodo is a very strong ethical character because he resisted up until the very end. He, continued to pity Gollum and continued to be kind and gentle throughout most of his ownership of the ring, all the way up to Mount Doom. And then in that final moment, he was unable to resist. And there's that moment when he took it back from Sam briefly, when he realized that he was in too deep. Like, I can't let go of it, Sam. Like, even now, I wouldn't be, if Sam held it back from him, I would think the ring would have such a hold over him at that point. He would have killed Sam if he had to get it back, and he knew that. But he's like second banana to Bilbo in terms of his moral strength, because he was able to carry it for so long. And not, he didn't get worse as he got to the mountain. He retained his pity and his kindness pretty much up until the very end. But right when it got to that moment, the ring was just too powerful for him and he lost it. So that's kind of the ring. And then there's another power in the books that vies with and against Sauron and this evil power. So Bilbo's finding of the ring is remarked upon, like the ring is trying to get back to its master, and it came upon the most unlikely person of all, Bilbo Baggins, right? So there's kind of another power in the world that's striving to aid folks who will avail themselves of it. There's another crazy thing where, Saruman himself destroys himself. If Saruman wouldn't have grabbed Merry and Pippin, the Ents would have never gotten involved, and Saruman's orcs would have probably destroyed Rohan at Helm's Deep. But because Saruman's greed went after the ring, Merry and Pippin were brought to a place where they were never supposed to be, and because of that, they roused the Ents, who then, took to task Saruman, defeated the orcs, and Saruman basically brought about his own downfall. So again, it's kind of like another power was kind of at work there, and that Saruman kind of defeated himself. You could say that maybe it was another layer of the evil, that, when you play in that evil world, like, beware. But it also could be another power striving against that, which brought about his downfall. So that's the ring and the evil. I'll briefly mention, most people really do talk about the other facets of this book, which is the world building and the lore. And I think, I'll talk a little bit about, people go back and forth about Tolkien. There is a group of like new weird people and folks who are, high on Lord Dunsany and Arthur Machen and Howard and all those folks who were doing fantasy way before Tolkien was back in the 20s and 30s. Because I think The Hobbit came out in the mid-30s and Rings came out in the 50s. So, Tolkien didn't invent fantasy by any means. Fantasy was, it was kind of, it was spooky and bizarre. But what Tolkien really did, which no one had really done before, Howard had kind of done it with the Hyborian Age, but he did world building. I don't think anybody had world builded like Tolkien before Tolkien. And I think, you can go back and say people were, the King of Elfland's daughter, people were Lord Dunsany and all that stuff they were writing, but they didn't do the world building to the extent that Tolkien did. And they didn't have these incredibly strong rules and these callbacks that were very consistent. And, these ruins of an earlier age that weren't just, you could, in a fantasy story, you can be like, oh, there are ruins all around you of like an earlier age. Tolkien actually developed the whole story of the earlier age and had, poems and specific legends and myths about what came before that were consistent and that tied into each other. So the world building that he did, and I think obviously, there was sword and sorcery and fairy fantasy before Tolkien, but no one had world builded like that before. I mean, that's from my brief reading and understanding of it, that's the thing that he really brought to fantasy was world building. And so, to me, the way I see the world building is that ruins everywhere, right? Amansul, the great watchtower, the evil of the north, the old kingdom of the north, the Argonath, those two wonderful statues, Orthanc, which was built, a long time ago, Moria, which is an old city, and the legends and the poems in there. There are all a lot of the poetry, Beren and Luthien, Gil-galad, like all of the things that had happened, these old poems or these old stories. You do have the backstory of Elendil in the last battle, which is kind of like, maybe prologue, but you have a whole second age, he gives you the sense that so much has happened in this world. This is age number 3. So I think I really recognize every time I read it that the world building, it's not just like, oh, Tolkien invented the quest fantasy narrative. We probably didn't. But what he did do was he complexified the nature of world building to such a degree that no one had done it before. And I think that's the main thing that the Tolkienites that came afterwards, they all did world building. They all did, Shannara was a whole world that was built. David Eddings, he had gods. And so people were like, they were world building now. And that became a thing in fantasy now, where if you were going to do an epic fantasy, you had to do a lot of world building. Whereas before that, like guys like Howard and Fritz Lieber, you can kind of do a generic, like, there's some bad guys and some wizards and some witches, and it's kind of a medieval setting, and here's the story. But again, I feel like Tolkien really, really blew this apart and really added this huge thing. So I definitely think that that's an amazing aspect, besides the characters and the spiritual aspect of good and evil and the world building. Now, the language and the prose, too, I think are, again, of a very high caliber, and you just don't get genre literature of any kind that's written with these good, solid English sentences and this beautiful writing. I mean, there are so many instances, but I'll just pick one because there are some horror elements in it that I think are really cool too. It's kind of Lovecraftian in a very small sense, but he's describing the dead marshes. And I just think this is just a great example of the power of the imagery and the language in Tolkien. So I'll read a little bit here. It was dreary and wearisome. Cold, clammy winter still held sway in this forsaken country. The only green was the scum of livid weed on the dark, greasy surfaces of the sullen waters. Dead grasses and rotting reeds loomed up in the mists like ragged shadows of long-forgotten summers. As the day wore on, the light increased a little and the mists lifted, growing thinner and more transparent. Far above the rot and vapors of the world, the sun was riding high and golden now in a serene country with floors of dazzling foam, but only a passing ghost of her could they see below, bleared, pale, giving no color and no warmth. So again, it's just there's a stately pace to his writing. His sentences are very just kind of arch, and they move with a wonderful cadence. And he was a linguist, so his command of the English language is pretty amazing. So again, besides the characters, the interesting take on what heroism really is, which I kind of went over, the nature of evil, which is brilliant, the spiritual aspects of the book, the world building, and now you have this language. you're starting to see why these books are held up as much as they are, and why they, they're not over. Tolkien's not like, well, Tolkien doesn't really play anymore. It really doesn't. These are timeless. This is a timeless book. It's written in a kind of fashion that will last forever. It doesn't matter what's happening, what the current literary trends are, or where we are with technology. These books are set in stone. And I don't think they're going to age very much. They are going to be classics for a long time, I think, for very good reasons. And so one thing I wanted to just touch on briefly is the humor. There's humor in this book. There's a lot of dark, very arch kind of overtones, which I love. But there's some really wonderful humor in that. I wanted to read a few pieces. So there's just a couple of random sentences. When Tolkien, as the narrator, is describing the hobbits, he's talking about Sam's father, and he goes, in the matter of roots, especially potatoes, the gaffer was recognized as the leading authority by all in the neighborhood, including himself. Just love that line. Some of the funniest bits are in the beginning in Fellowship. When Bilbo is selling Bag End, he puts these gift tags on a lot of things in the hole for people to give away. And they all have these funny little wry things to them. So I want to read them because I think they're really funny. For Adelard took for his very own from Bilbo on an umbrella. Adelard had carried off many unlabeled ones. For Milo Burrows, hoping it will be useful from BB on a gold pen and ink bottle. Milo never answered letters. For Angelica's use from Uncle Bilbo on a round convex mirror. She was a young Baggins and too obviously considered her face shapely. For the collection of Hugo Bracegirdle from a contributor on an empty bookcase. Hugo is a great borrower of books and worse than usual at returning them. For Lobelia's Sackville Baggins as a present on a case of silver spoons. Bilbo believed she had acquired a good many of his spoons while he was away on his former journey. Lobelia knew that quite well. When she arrived later in the day, she took the point at once. But she also took the spoons. Love that, just love that. And then there's one brief thing when Sam kind of gets angry. At one point in the book, I think they're fighting at Khazad-dûm, and Sam is like in the fray of things, right? And he goes, when 13 had fallen, the rest fled shrieking, leaving the defenders unharmed, except for Sam, who had a scratch along the scalp. A quick duck had saved him, and he had felled his orc, a sturdy thrust with his barrow blade. A fire was smoldering in his brown eyes that would have made Ted Sandyman step backwards if he had seen it. Ted Sandyman is kind of his Shire nemesis in a way. So again, the humor is wonderful. And it's a tragic ending. On top of all this stuff, the ending is very tragic because Frodo kind of doesn't come home to a triumphant life. The attack at Weathertop and the poisoning by Shelob constantly affect him, and he's sick all the time. So he's back at Bag End in the Shire, but he's not well. And he takes years and years and years, and finally he recognizes, and he says that, the world is saved, but not for me, right? It's not for my doing. And one thing that I discovered in the book on this read-through is that he's able to go to the Blessed Lands because Arwen gives up her seat. So there's a line in the book where Arwen says, I'm giving up my seat on the boat to go back to the Blessed Lands, and I'm going to give myself to Aragorn, and I'm going to live and die here. And Frodo, please, that seat is yours. Take it if you ever feel the need, it is yours. So there's a point where Frodo realizes that he's just not going to get better, and he's not well, and he's not happy, and it was too much. The ring was too much. The adventure was kind of too much for him. It took too much out of him. So, the spiritual reward is he's able to go to these blessed lands with the elves, where his ultimate reward is that his spirit will finally be at rest. It's kind of nebulous what the blessed lands are. The elves can kind of come back from the blessed lands back and forth, but I think as human beings, if you go, in some ways, that's it. It's kind of like heaven, Tolkien's version of heaven, in some way. I'm not exactly sure, but I think that's kind of the case. So yeah, it's very sad. Like when they go to the Grey Havens, and he tries to give Merry and Pippin the slip, and they show up anyway, and Sam doesn't realize he's leaving until he gets there. It's a tearjerker, man. After all that has happened, it really is a tough tragic ending, but it's right. Like there's something right about it. I think if it would have been a slightly lesser book if Frodo gets back to Bag End and he's the mayor of Bag End and lives happily ever after, right? There's something about that doesn't quite play. So I really feel like Lord of the Rings needs to be kind of reevaluated for it's kind of anti-trope in a lot of ways. It's accused, I think, a lot of times of being very tropey, but I think if you really look underneath the hood, it's very anti-tropey and a wonderful masterpiece. So I'm going to talk a little bit. The movies are really a big deal. So I'm going to do a separate podcast about the movies and the books and how they relate and my feelings about the movies as well. I think this has gone on long enough, so I'm going to cease and desist. So hope you enjoyed my take on one of my favorite books of all time, Lord of the Rings, and I will see you next time.